Now this cemetery was opened in 1787, and it was a land grant from the King of Spain. You realize the French owned this territory, and then at the end of the French and Indian War, the French lost, and they gave the territory to the Spanish because they didn't want to give it to the British. So now the King of Spain owns all of the property around here. So he gave this land to the French for a cemetery. Why do you think he would give this bit of land for a cemetery? What do you think would be better here, or not better here? If you look around, look at all the hills.
It's very hilly.
Probably you wouldn't want to own this as farmland. So the king gave it as a cemetery in 1787, and it closed in 1882 because in 1882, every time they dig to bury somebody, they would find another grave. There's no map of this territory at all. You know, you go to a modern cemetery and you say, I'm looking for my great-grandmother. Her name is, and they get out a map and they go down here, make a left, go so far, count in 6 stones. We don't have that here. They just dug and went down and found bodies. So that's when they decided to close it. There were many cholera epidemics, and they were afraid that if they opened the grave of a cholera victim, that it would let that loose on the land again. And so I've asked a couple of doctors, and some of them said it could do that, and others have said, oh no, that wouldn't happen. But in the 1800s, they didn't want to take any chances. So they closed in 1872. The last burial was in 1894 because the lady that gave the land for the new cemetery, I'm going to blow my head off, gave it with the proviso that she could be buried in the old cemetery where her husband was. So you'll talk to her later this evening because she comes in every year for this, you know, and we like that, you know, all the people that come back. So it was closed and it was kind of left alone. And in the early days of St. Genevieve, up till the 1920s or so, they had open grazing. That if you had a cow or chickens or something, pigs, they roamed all over the land. You see the boulder cuts that has that big fence around it? It wasn't because of Indians or anything. It was to keep the cows and the chickens and the pigs out of their garden. So in 1905, there was a big brouhaha that the pigs were wallowing on the graves of their ancestors. So they began to do a little bit of work to recover the cemetery and treat it correctly. There was a lot of outrage there. I don't know how much they did then. In the 1920s, the same thing with the same problem. So they did some restoration work. They mowed the grass in here, but it was in the 1930s that they really got serious about it, and they put a fence completely around the cemetery. It was a WPA project during the Roosevelt presidency, and so they kept the animals out so that they weren't wallowing on the graves of our ancestors. And that cemetery stayed, or the fence stayed until 1998, 2000, something like that. And then the foundation, I'm with the Foundation for the Restoration of St. Genevieve, and we got the funds and purchased the cemetery gate or fence that is around here, and put it up. And so now those pigs and the cows just better stay out of here. And so that's what we hope anyway. And I haven't seen any pigs or cows coming in. But when you also come into the cemetery, generally speaking, at this time, a cemetery had everybody of the same whatever. If this was a Catholic cemetery, everybody here would be Catholic. Well, if you look around, right around here, these are a lot of Catholic people. But there's a bunch of Protestants that are buried up in the far corner. The Lutherans were buried up there, and they had, later when they had their own cemetery, they took some of them out and took them to the Lutheran cemetery. There's some that have no religious affiliation. They had people on the way to the gold rush in California in 1849. They would die on their steamboats that are going west, and they would drop them off at the riverboat landing with a note pinned on them saying, "This is so-and-so, he died, he was on the way to the gold rush, please bury him." And so they were buried in here. In 1859, there was a steamboat explosion outside on the river, just north of town. And so the people from St. Genevieve went out and grabbed the dead bodies. And so they brought all of those dead bodies up here and buried them in a mass grave. And so those are the victims of the Dr. Franklin too. We've had people in that were the descendants of some of the survivors. They are descendants of those people who already had children that died. So we've heard from some people to tell us their story of their ancestors who were buried there. Now the question was, where is that burial? And when we first started looking, we got all kinds of responses as to where it was at, and they, don't you know it's right down in that corner down there? Until I asked the next expert, and he says, "Well, everybody knows it's over against that fence. Just go straight back here." And then somebody said, "Well, no, it's in the swale. It's right in the middle of the swale." And so we did ground penetrating radar. We had an Save Our American Treasures grant, and we had some things that we wanted to know. One of them was, is anybody buried on this pathway? Because it was the pathway coming in. When we first started this, it was rutted as a wagon had come in to bring the bodies in and offload them to bury them. And so we did not want to do anything here if anybody was buried here. Nobody is buried in this pathway. So that's when we laid the various things down, the chat down and what have you. So it wasn't there. We wanted to find the Dr. Franklin too, and we did. It is now, if you go to Dr. Lynn's grave, Dr. Senator Lynn, and you look down into the swale and you get right at the cusp of the hill, there's a stone that says 1852, and that's the mass grave. Just as you're going off, it's like if you take another step, you're going to slide down the hill, and that's where that is. We also wanted to know if there were indeed Indians buried in the swale, and we went to all this trouble. We were told that Indians buried with their toes painted due east, and so that's what we were looking for, was graves like that. And so we found graves exactly like that. But then a year or two later, we had an Indian chief and his medicine man that came, and they said, "We'll tell you where the graves of Indians are at, because we know when we're passing over the top of Native Americans." And they went, and I was in costume and nobody else was, which is usually how it goes. And so as they would go, they would stop and they would ring, they had some bells and some incense and everything, and they would stop, and he would find me in the crowd, and he would go. So we came very close. I didn't have the exact map with me to say yes, that's true, but it's very close to where I knew there were Indian graves. So we found that out that they are buried and they are in the swale. So we didn't do the whole cemetery because maybe they're buried. Others are buried outside of the swale, but we did find that out. So that's good. Anyway, it was closed in 1882. They had some uproar in 1905, 1920, 1935. In 1935, Senator Lynn's going to tell you about what happened in 1935, and the children came out. So you'll hear that. But we then had another restoration in 1968, 1997. In 1997, when we were looking at to apply for that Save Our American Treasures grant, it was who owns the cemetery. It was all of a sudden, well, who does own the cemetery? Since 1935, the city of St. Genevieve has applied a tax to everybody that resides inside the city limits. And you all pay, any of you inside the city limits? Nope. Very good. You're not paying city taxes for the upkeep of the cemetery. But they have done that. They've applied a city tax, and they didn't own the cemetery. And so by the time we realized that it went all the way to the Spanish king, and it was given as a gift to the Roman Catholic citizens of St. Genevieve, not to the parish, and not to any particular person or entity, not to the parish, not to the archdiocese, not to any one group, but to the Roman Catholic citizens. So we went to the archdiocese, and they said they did not want to own it. We went to the parish, and they did not want to own it. We went to the Roman Catholic citizens as to Mass and let everybody know, and did they want to own it? No one person wanted to own it. So after that, we asked the city if they would like to own it. So it is now city property, and that's with the proviso that I'm going to take this. This is going to mess up your video stuff. That's bad enough. Anyway, so it's now owned by the city. It is administered by the Foundation for the Restoration of St. Genevieve. So we apply for any grants or things of that nature. We had, during that Save Our American Treasures grant, we spent $160,000 during restoration of the stones, and about 60 stones, and 50 or 60 stones, which matched, so that was $210,000 for the stones. And we still now do about 5 or 6 every year. By the time we get done with those, we figure the first ones we do will be in need of restoration again. So we can, it's just a continuous thing to go on and do that restoration. But we like it. We like what we're doing. It's great to see the stones up. It's great to see this looking so good, and we like seeing people in here enjoying it, even just walking around and using it for exercise. So we're really happy to have it here, and as a great, and it's great for people to come in and stop and look and say, "That's my last name. I must be related to people buried here." And very probably, if you've lived in Missouri for a number of years and your family is here for generations, you probably are related to somebody that is buried in this cemetery. So,
well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, I just wanted to say.
Colonel Felix St. James was actually born in December of 1830. He was actually born as Joseph Felix St. Jim. And he's buried here. This is his parents. You see St. Jim, actually St. Jim. But St. Joseph was actually practicing lawyer, but he was running for Congress or representative in Missouri, and at that time the politics and thing and St. Jim was more pro-Southern, and he wanted it. So we suspect then one of the reasons why he may have changed his name to St. James. He didn't want it to be St. Jim or St. James. But he changed it to St. James, and one suspicion is that so that he wouldn't have that political connection because he wanted to really run. But he got defeated. Came back to St. Genevieve, and then after the outbreak of the Civil War, he volunteered for certain things. There was a couple of first Missouri volunteer groups that were formed here in St. Genevieve, Perry County. See, one was the 3rd Missouri Regiment. I can't recall the other one. But ultimately then they were actually called up and they had to report to Sherman at the Battle of Shiloh. And when he was at the Shiloh, then he was assigned to the 13th Missouri Regiment, and he served as second in command. But at the Battle of Shiloh, which was actually was devastating for the Union troops, the Confederates actually had beaten Union troops on the first. And it was only after reformation and then support troops from Ohio, where they crossed the Tennessee River, and with that additional troops, the Union Army countered attack and ultimately pushed the Confederates away. That was one of the first bloodiest battles in the city. There was over 25,000 casualties each one. There's stories. There was a church there, and they talk about how the rivers flowed. So, but anyway, while that first day, Lieutenant Colonel St. James was mortally wounded that first day. So he actually died on April 8th. But then on April 14th, his body was then brought back to St. Genevieve, placed here. And we have a Sons of Union Veterans Camp, which we are all descendants of Union soldiers or members who want to honor the soldiers in blue. Our camp here in St. Genevieve is called the Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Felix St. James Camp. So that's we honor him on his death every year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mortan Aubuchon. My name is Martin Aubuchon. My heritage is from this town. I am connected to the Aubuchon. Comment ça va? How are you? How are you? How are you? Très bien. Very good. Okay. Yeah, très bien. Very good. My older ancestor was Antoine Aubuchon. He was born in Montreal in 1705. He ultimately came down the Kaskaskia Island. He had a brother, Gabriel Aubuchon, who was a cynic. That's a French term for clerk over at Kaskaskia. Not cynic, or syndic. Not a cynic, but a syndic. Yeah, syndic. And then he was there. Some records saves them in about 1739. But then somewhere he came across the Mississippi, and it was in St. Genevieve because in 1752 there was a census of St. Genevieve, which consisted of 7 families. And his name is one of the 7 families, Antoine Aubuchon. The Antons were farmers. You look at the censors, they were all listed as farmers. They weren't as influential as Francois Vallée, which I have the honor of saying I am connected because Marguerite Vallée was the illegitimate daughter of Francois Vallée, an Indian woman. She married Louis Caron several generations down. There was a Marie Julia Caron married Louis Aubuchon. So I actually have, genealogically speaking, I have a connection with Francois Vallée. But, so anyway, so there were, and let's see, there was a family said they live in an Aubuchon house, okay, up the street, so it's got to be a distant cousin. But Aubuchons is very common in this area, along with the Boyers, the Clues. It is an old French name, and yes, I have a lot of distant cousins. Perry County, St. Genevieve County, Washington County. But one of the interesting stories involving the name of Aubuchon occurred in 1787, something like that. It involved a civil trial and also a military trial. And the reason for the military trial is New York history. Okay, what government controlled this part of the country around 1787. We were French, right? It was St. Genevieve is a French community established. Yes, yeah, Spanish. And the reason for the Spanish control is because you've all heard the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. Well, of course, France lost that. And then by treaty, then, all the kings, they're doing their negotiations. The area east of the Mississippi became under British control. The area east of the Mississippi became under Spanish control. So even though this was a French community, we were controlled by the Spanish. And I'm giving you a little background here. So because of that, militarily speaking, defense was mostly done by the militia. So there was over 150 French militia here in St. Genevieve. But being under Spanish control, or Spanish government, they did have a small Spanish regular army here. Their command lieutenant Billers, and I think approximately 10 Spanish regulars. So, if there have been any defense, it was all done by the French militia. So, I'll give you a little more basic facts. I'll try to keep it short. There was a trapper, hunter by the name of Celedon. He was a Métis, which means he was mixed blood. And he comes into town. While he's in town, he's making friends with Lieutenant Villers, the Spanish government. Lieutenant Villers liked to sell tafia, which is a kind of like a sweet rum. Yep, tafia. But then he's also making friends with an Indian slave, which is owned by Elizabeth Aubuchon by the name of Marguerite. There was a event, a party, and Lieutenant Villers, Celedon, Marguerite, so they all, and some other St. Genevieve inhabitants, they all go across the river to Fort de Chartres. Socializing. And while there, Celedon established a relationship with an Indian guy who basically, you could say that the army there, she was just kind of like a puppet for soldier. But anyway, so he struck it there. And while he was and we know, he basically was looking for a partner, somebody to accompany him over at the hunting. And so, I'll paraphrase it because we know a lot of this based on a civil trial, which was conducted by Francois Vallée, who was the civil here, and then a military judge that came in too, because the facts indicate that Lieutenant Villers was Spanish. So there was a civil trial. There was actually a Spanish trial. And the facts were up in some of the records. And we know the Spanish facts because they found these over in Seville, Spain. And they correlate. Facts correlate. So, but anyway, I'll paraphrase. In essence, Celedon was looking for a mate. He goes one night, goes over to Fort Deschard. He crosses the river, and there was an accident. And we know there was an accident because the trappers were out one day, and they found a shallow grave, and she had been shot. So they hear about this in town. Francois Valley, they suspect Celedon would kill her. He sends out a posse looking for him to bring him back. They never find him. But at the same time, needlessly, there's a trial investigation going on. And they go to Marguerite, the Indian slave owned by Elizabeth. They put her in chains, which is kind of unusual because at that time, basically, any slave, black, they were more treated like indentured servants. Everybody goes, because where are you going to go anyway? It's a real town. And so they put her in chains. They're interviewing her, asking her a lot of questions, and essentially she says, there's no relationship, whatever. But anyway, in the evening, Celedon sneaks back into town, goes to the residence of Elizabeth Aubuchon, convinces her to go with him. She asked, there was not room for two brothers. She had two sons. She asked the older brother to go with them, and the older brother said, "No, I cannot leave my little brother." So anyway, they leave town, and so the trial investigation is still going on. They interviewed hunters, trappers at New City, and one of the biggest testimonies they say Celedon owned a rifle that had a hair trigger. So based on that testimony, they never prosecuted Celedon for because they paid it for the bird, which is viable because if you go across the river and you're going to bring somebody back and you're looking for a partner, are you going to shoot it? So anyway, so Marguerite basically was Celedon's second choice. And again, we know a lot of this because based on asking the sons and hunters so the trial then was declared an accident. Celedon technically was guilty of compensation, paying Elizabeth compensation because she was a slave. And he actually said that he would, but it was never collected. The Spanish government didn't condone slavery anyway, so they condoned that anyway. But we'd hear from the hunters that from time to time they had contact with Celedon and Marguerite because they would camp out over in the Black River, just west of River. And so we do know the story. We hear from their stories. And one of the things that Marguerite always asked, she'd always inquire about the boys, and if they were also given a good Christian education. So this incident, these facts are actually in two books. One called Colonial St. Genevieve, written by Carl Eckberg, who's a well-known, he's a professor emeritus from University of Illinois, and he's a big knowledgeable professor in all French history and French history in this area. So he mentions that, and then he wrote another book called Silver Men and Women, and that's both in that story. And then he had a son-in-law. His sister. No, it's not son-in-law. His nephew, is his sister, and they funded a documentary movie called Celedon Under the Same Stars. So there's a movie out, you can get it on the computer, at the Village Valley House. visitor center on the last one. But anyway, it's kind of a documentary movie that talks about these things.
Now, what happened to Marguerite's first husband?
The age of 30. At 30 years of age, I was a woman well past my prime. The life expectancy of a woman in Missouri at that time was 39. I was a school teacher here in St. Genevieve, and I never married. If I'd have married, I could no longer teach school. That was the law in the country at that time. My contract was written that room and board was included. That usually meant I lived with the families who were sending their children to the school. The more children you had, the longer I stayed at your house. Most of the time, I would walk with your children to school. There were very rare occasions that the families had an extra horse or an extra buggy or a cart for me to use. Cholera was a disease that took approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of this town between 1853 and 1857. It was a disease transmitted through the water.
It was the water.
Most people getting their water into their homes at that time were doing so with a bucket, probably from the Gabourey Creek or another nearby stream or a pond. And usually that bucket was sitting in the house and everyone was using the same dipper or ladle to drink from. And you did until the bucket was empty. Most of the buckets were made of wood. An oak bucket, which was a very hard wood and was readily available. But summer in Missouri and water sitting in a bucket is nothing but a place for germs to grow. Cholera was a disease that took people quickly. It was a disease sometimes called the sinking disease. Not only were you very tired and struggling to stand, you were also incredibly thirsty. So what did you do? You drank more water. By day 2, quite often you were struggling to raise your head from the bed to drink more water. And by day 3, quite often you were being carried out the door. The day that Genevieve was buried, there were 39 buried in this cemetery, all died of cholera.
And do you have an unmarked grave because you were a teacher?
No,
Or
because I think because there were so many being buried at that
There
time.
just wasn't enough time to...
I just find it remarkable that they have the list of all 39 and their ages and occupations and what they died of.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Amazing record for
the
that.
records to me are amazing.
Guten Abend, or good evening. My name is Juliana Super. I was a Siebert before I met and married my husband, Lawrence. I was born in Bolshevik, September 8th of 1821. And I met and married my husband, Lawrence, in 1841. We had our first and only child, a daughter named Sophia, in May 15th of 1842. And that helped prompt us to travel to St. Genevieve. A lot of our friends and family were already traveling here. This is very much the sister city to Bolshevik. So we traveled in the dead of winter. We landed down in New Orleans January 30th of 1843. We then traveled up the river system to land here in St. Genevieve. Unfortunately for me, this is about where my story starts to take a turn. I passed away here May 14th of 1843. I was a few months shy of turning 22 years old, and I was 1 day shy of my daughter Sophia's first birthday. Shortly after my passing,
French names were members or participated
no, honey, you were born a year after me.
In 1822.
We've been asleep. So whenever I was 11 years old, my family came from Freudenberg, Germany, which is a town on the Main River. It's similar to St. Genevieve. And my family always had the idea they were coming here because it's sort of a sister city to Freudenberg. And also we already had friends and family that were already
People
here.
wanted to join
So we
groups.
came into Baltimore Fort, Maryland
So
in
you had
1833
Friends, families
and with our
who
destination
signed
again,
up
always St.
to be
Genevieve.
members of the
So as time went on, after Juliana's passing, I married Lawrence 2 months after she passed away. And we went on to raise their daughter, and then I had 11 children.
McGill was from a very Catholic part of Ireland.
Yeah, we were quite good. And my husband, all of them survived the birth, but I did have 2 children that passed away at young ages. One was 4 and one was just a baby. But all of my children were baptized in the Church of St. Genevieve, and they went on to open businesses here, and they helped my husband with his business, which was in making buggies and farm implements. And we settled in an area called Zell, which is a little bit north of here. So I passed away in 1870 at the age of 48. And Lawrence said he must have been very fond of both Juliana and I, because we have matching headstones. And he buried us next to each other. He wasn't one to let the grass grow under his feet, because 2 months after I passed away, he remarried a 3rd time. And rumor is they had a couple children, and she's actually buried out in Zell. So she's not here with us, and we're not quite sure where Lawrence is buried.
That you could see
It's
on
unfortunate,
this
but we're
map
not sure where
that
he's
you could
buried.
have seen. And we're working each year to
Thank you. Thank you.
If it got cleaned, would be the same color as this. And you can see some of it doesn't have the moss and the lichen on it. There's only, I think there's only one other pillar like this with a flat top on it in the cemetery, and it's got somebody's name on it. And it's up there where the Swells are buried, the wealthy French folks are. I don't know what this is. There's a hole up here, so you could mount a statue of an angel or something up there. But there's nothing saying who this is for. And I don't know if this is associated with this or associated with this. Now, the Masons, you can see pillars like this in cemeteries, old cemeteries around the country. And usually they're jagged, and that is a symbol of a young man or somebody who died young, whose life was cut short, like the pillar cracked. And so it was a symbol that the Victorians took to heart. Obviously this isn't jagged. And I apologize if I'm repeating, but I don't know that this is connected to this. I don't know what this is. It's the only monument. You don't even see faded lettering on this or anything. So I don't know if this is LeGray and Company showing that they can build a fluted pillar or what they're doing here either. Start my spiel all over.
He was a mason?
I was a stonemason. So everything we know about me is on this tombstone here. And what we know about me is that this is sacred to the memory of Dennis McGill, a native of Killybegs, Ireland, died June 22nd, 1844, age 33 years. So we don't know if I was married. I'm not a beloved father. I'm not a beloved husband. I'm not a beloved brother. I'm not beloved, except over here it says, this monument was erected by the shopmates of the deceased A.L. LeGray and Company contributors. And then we see the tools of my trade up here, which are a stonemason's tools. We see a mallet, we see a compass, we see an edge. And up here, we can only assume these are the names of the shopmates that I had. And they are carved all around. Back here, there's a very odd carving. Everything else is basically the same, but James C. Orr has a very primitive carving. So, you know, to me, this is a monument to a working man, and everything else, these may be good family men and all that, and up on the top of the hill, the bigger the monument, the wealthier the person. Except here, this is a stonemason whose shopmates erected this, and the company contributed to it. So think about that for a second. I don't know how many of you expect to have your co-workers put something like this up for you when you die, but I don't expect any of my co-workers that, like somebody here said, they might leave a beer can at the cross, you know, just an empty beer can at the cross as a memory or a token, but I don't think they're going to do that. So think about how remarkable that is for just a second. Everything else that I'm going to say is speculation. but I'm Irish, you can't prove me wrong, and so I'm going to go do some speculation. I'm going to start with the fact that I was proud to be from Killybegs. Anybody here know anything about Killybegs? It's the largest fishing port in Ireland. It's in County Donegal, and it was a hotbed of Catholic resistance to English rule in Ireland. In 1588, when the Spanish Armada came to rescue England from the clutches of the Protestants, the storm hit, sunk most of the Armada. La Giron, a Spanish ship, made it into Killybegs, and the peasants in Killybegs housed the sailors, kept them protected from the English, rebuilt the ship so that that ship could sail and do battle with the English again. It ran into another storm and sank. But some of the sailors stayed behind, and you might have heard the expression, the black Irish with the curly hair. They're supposedly descended from Spanish Armada sailors, but who knows? So by the time I was born and before that, this still was a hotbed of resistance to English rule in Ireland. And about 20 years before I was born, there was the Wolf Tone Uprising. They were seeking what was called Catholic emancipation. Catholics could not legally own land in Ireland. They couldn't vote. They couldn't serve in the military. And the Wolf Tone Uprising was against the oppression of the Catholics in that regard. Nothing really happened. The English weren't giving an inch until Napoleon came along and the British needed Irish soldiers. And then emancipation began to get some wind under its sails and things began to change. About the time that I was a teenager, there was another uprising in Ireland led by a man named Thomas O'Connell. Some of you may have eaten at O'Connell's restaurant up in St. Louis. Great hamburgers. That's the O'Connell. I don't think he had anything to do with hamburgers, but that's the restaurant. So when I would have been a teenager, that uprising would have been going on, and eventually, before our Civil War, there was complete emancipation in Ireland. Catholics could sit in Parliament, priests could legally and openly be priests in Ireland. How did I get to St. Genevieve? So up until the opening of the Erie Canal, I would have gotten here through New Orleans. I would have taken the Mississippi up from New Orleans. But after the Erie Canal, the Irish came over primarily through the Erie Canal and from East Coast cities, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, those sort of cities. Before the potato famines, there still was a sizable Irish population in the United States. Approximately 1 out of 10 Americans said they were Irish Americans. That's how they categorized themselves. So I'm from Killybegs, a very Catholic town, which leads me to one question that I've got. Was I a Mason? Was I a member of a Masonic lodge? There's no clear answer, but probably not. So St. Genevieve is the town where the first Masonic lodge west of the Mississippi was established. So there's a monument to that down on St. Mary's Road. And you will see some prominent St. Genevieve families, Catholic names, associated with the establishment of the lodge. But in the 1730s, up until very recently, the Catholic Church's position was you can't be a Mason and a Catholic. It was grounds for automatic excommunication until the 1980s, and it is still generally frowned upon. And in the 1840s, the Masons didn't like the Catholics, and the Catholics didn't like the Masons. So the odds of an Irishman from Killybegs being a member of a Masonic lodge, to me, seem kind of remote, but not impossible, because there are valleys who participated in the formation of the Masonic lodge here in St. Gen. But remember, 1808, this was a frontier town, and wealthy Frenchmen were marrying American Indians, and by the 1840s, we were no longer footloose and fancy-free like that anymore. We were too civilized, and so I don't think that he was a member of a Masonic lodge at all. So, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself here, but I also want to talk about what was happening to to the stonemason trade by the 1840s, by the time he was dying. It was flagging. Wealthy people were not using stone to build their houses. You have the academy up here that's beautiful stonework. Our Catholic church that is now brick was made of stone. You had the old cathedral in St. Louis that was made of stone. But by the 1840s, the Germans are pouring in, and the English, the Americans are coming in, and they love their brick. You can do things cheaper with brick, and you can do things fancier with brick. So what is a stonemason to do? Well, build tombstones. Because all the Victorians love their fancy tombstones, and they take great pride in them, and they want to keep up with the Joneses. So when Dennis McGill dies and his company decides to put up this tombstone for him, I think some of that is marketing. I think some of that is telling everybody in St. John, you want a fancy tombstone, go see LeGray and Company. Now, I don't have any record of LeGray and Company, but I don't have any record showing who put up these tombstones either, any other rival company. But I think that this was both because his shopmates respected him, and also because LeGray and Company wanted the world to know that they were the go-to company for your tombstone. I think that I cry every time I look out here and I see that what once was a beautiful stone church is now made of German brick. So I think I'm fine. But I want to talk about how fancy this is. You look at any other tombstone here, you don't see it mounted on these posts here. You can't stick your arm through it. So you go up and look at all the wealthy Frenchmen and the wealthy Americans on top of the hill, you won't see any fancy work like this. You'll see this only in the Irish slums down here where the water gathers and all that. So I think that I died on the job. I think that I was killed working as a stonemason. These are very heavy pieces, and you're loading them by muscle, either your muscle or a horse's muscle, and a pulley, and you're setting this thing up. And I think that my co-workers demanded that their boss put up a monument for me, and LeGray and Company said, all right, we will. But we're going to make it a billboard advertising LeGray and Company as well as a monument to Dennis McGill. I can't prove any of that, but you can't prove that I'm wrong either. So, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Pardon?
Delassus de Lousière.
Did you escape the guillotine?
Yes, I did, and I will tell you how.
Okay.
So, my name is Pierre-Charles Delassus de Lousière, and I was born in Bouchon, which is up in the northwest corner near Calais in France. Bouchon was our town that we were pretty high up in the hierarchy. I was born in 1738. 1753, I met my wife, Domitille Joseph Dumont. She was 20 years old, and she married me for my title, honestly. I married her for her money. So we ended up having 5 children, 4 boys, Pierre, Charles, Philippe, and Jacques, and 1 daughter, Jean Félicité. And I was doing well. I became the mayor of Bouchon. I was a commissioner in the French Royal Navy, and I was a consular to King Louis XVI. So we would go down to Paris, and we would get in the grand carriages, and we would ride the parades down to Paris. And things were going good until this thing called the French Revolution kind of started. And with a name like Delassus de Lousière, I was kind of in trouble. But I'd kind of seen things coming, and I was smart. So I bought land in Gallipolis, Ohio, just down from Pittsburgh, $2,000 worth. And this was around 1790. And so I decided, as the French Revolution started to heat up, we're going to go to America. So I get myself, my wife, Domitille, 4 of my kids, 1 boy decided to stay in France, a harp, a painting, and 8 servants, and we came to America. When I got to Pittsburgh, I found out that that whole deal at Gallipolis was a land swindle. None of the French that had bought land there had title to the land. So what was I going to do? I'd heard of this little town on the Mississippi called Saint-Jean-Ville. They're Frenchmen. So I'm going to move there. So he comes here, and he actually settled just south of town here up on the bluffs, in a little area that was at that time called Mont Généreux, Generous Mountain. It was also called Calvary at one time. I eventually named it Nouvelle Bourbon, New Bourbon, after the French king. There was nothing that we liked here about the libertad, the freedom, all this stuff of the French Revolution. That didn't go here. We were royalists here. Even the French that were here before I got here were royalists, so you weren't going to do any of this stuff that they were doing in Paris at the time. So I moved here, but I don't have any land. I don't have a title, and I was used to that. So luckily, growing up, I had a friend. His name was Hector Baron de Grandelet, and he was the governor of Louisiana down in New Orleans. So I went down to him and I said, Hector, I need a title. I need some land. He says, here, I'll do it for you. So he gave me part of the land that belonged to the St. Genevieve district of the powerful Valley family. Land on the hill, land down in the big field where they farmed. And so I now became a commandant of all the civil and military affairs in the post of New Bourbon. I was the captain of the militia. Other than the Catholic priest, I was it. And they didn't have a Catholic priest in New Bourbon. He was in St. Genevieve. So I'm it. Well, I also told Hector that I wanted grants to build water mills because the French only had horse-drawn mills and they weren't very efficient. And he wanted to build boat manufacturing. He wanted land to improve the agriculture here. He wanted to build levees. Even back then, he said the river floods 2 out of 5 years. So New Bourbon's up on this hill, so it's a lot better than Old Town St. John, which is right on the river. But the farmland would get flooded 2 out of 5 years, so he thought levees would be good. None of those things of my ideas worked. I started them but never could finish them. So I started to get a lot of debt, and my son Carlos had to step in. He's now the lieutenant governor of Upper Louisiana. You may not know, but you are standing in Louisiana territory here. Under the Spanish, we were Alta Louisiana. We were the district of Louisiana after the Americans came in. So I like to tell my friends down south in New Orleans, I'm from Louisiana. But Carlos was the last Spanish lieutenant governor in St. Louis. There was an event on March 9th and 10th, 1804. We had been French until 1763 when they lost the French Indian War. Then we became Spanish till 1800. And from 1800, Napoleon got it back. And so by the Louisiana Purchase, we're French again. The French never sent anybody here in the 4 years that Napoleon owned it, so we still had a Spanish lieutenant governor and a Spanish governor. And on March 9th in St. Louis, they lowered the Spanish flag, they raised the French flag, and they let it on the flagpole overnight. And the next day, they lowered the French flag and the American flag overnight. And Jean-Baptiste Valley, who you may have talked to, wrote in a letter, he says, we are now all Americans. So I think that he always knew how to go along with the powers that be down in the New Graces. So, my life didn't end like I thought it would. In 1806, my wife Domotee died and was buried here in this cemetery. I don't know where. We don't know where. There's no tombstone. I died 3 months later. No tombstone. For a man that was a French aristocrat, you would think I would have that big monument on the hill, but no. There's very little left of New Bourbon. I think at one time it was like 150, 200 houses. Now it's about 5. There is a town just 35 miles from here called Delasusse. It's got about 20 houses. And there is a house south of St. Genevieve called the Kern Delasusse house. I said my house was the biggest house in St. Genevieve. There was a post on the sill. And After I died, somebody took the timbers and built a house down on Rubio Plain. It was eventually owned by the Kern family, and that's called the Kern de la Suze House, and it's now part of the national park here in St. Genevieve. So there is a little bit of legacy there. The last of it is Carl Eckberg, who is the quintessential author of Colonial St. Genevieve, wrote a wonderful book called A French Aristocrat in the American West. Now, it's the story of my life. It's the story of my dreams and my failures.
Okay, thank you for coming. So, I am Marie Villers, and I was born May 20th of 1790, and I died May 3rd of 1846. So I lived around here for 56 years. The family farm was located between the River Oxfoss and the Saline. My family had a strong military presence. My mother was Marie Louise Valley, and my father was Francis Valley. He was commandant in the old town of St. Genevieve. My father, Louis de Villers, was commandant, also in the old town of St. Genevieve. His father was also Louis, but he was commandant in the town of Nouvelle Bourbon, so the south of here. And to give you a timeline, he served from 1770 until 1776. So keep in mind, at that time there was a lot going on in this town. You had the Cours de Bois that were coming down from Canada. Those were the woodsmen. And you had the voyageurs or voyeurs that were coming up from Louisiana, and they all met here. And there was a lot of trade. You had the fur trade. At that time, there was already mining established in the old mines area. So those people were all going back and forth, plus you had the river traffic, and kind of give you an idea of everything that was going on. But the town was also still in its early stages and still being settled. So my brother Joseph married Eleonora St. Jim Beauvais. And Eleonora was the niece of wealthy merchant Vital St. Jim Beauvais. He's actually buried in the far corner of the cemetery. He did a lot of trade between Kaskaskia and here. My sister Marie Mathilda married Pierre Charles Camille de Halt de la Suze. His father was Philip Francis Camille de Halt de la Suze de Louisière. Okay, the big story though is his son, Charles de Halt de la Suze, who was commandant, but also the last lieutenant governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory from 1799 until 1803. So he actually had dealings with Lewis and Clark. My sister Euphrosyne, we like to call her Eugenia, she married John Price. Now, John was a wealthy Kentuckian, and the first thing he did when he came to town was build the old brick tavern. My sister Marcelie married Joseph Herditch. Now, Joseph, he's buried right here with his children on either side. He was a Swiss immigrant, and he came to town in 1810. Well, he was not just wealthy, he was an educator, and he realized the town had no school. So the first thing he did was build a school. It was called the School of the Asylum, and it was located on the river Oxfoss, close to our farm. And he was really kind of radical for the time. He taught in what is known as the Pestalozzi method, meaning he felt that students would learn more from taking nature walks or being outside where they could learn about astronomy. And the great thing was, a lot of the students went on to become very prominent citizens and senators, and for the rest of their lives, they thanked Joseph for the education he provided. You know, some of them were like Augustus Caesar Dodge and George Jones Wallace and Louis Vital Bogie. They were senators, and they sang his praises for a very long time. Well, his notoriety got him chosen to be the first warden of the first Masonic Lodge west of the Mississippi, and it was called the Louisiana Number 109, and meetings were held in the Janie Ziegler Tavern, Green Tree Tavern. And as you know, it is still south of town. Also, in 1833, Governor Dunklin decided, finally, to form a commission to start the first public school system, and he asked Joseph to head up that commission. So there you have it. I think they did a lot.
Would you all like to hear our story?
Yes.
Well, tonight you've seen many tombstones here that mark the graves of people buried here. But there are many, many people buried here that don't have a stone to mark their grave. And we represent some of those people. In particular, we represent a group of people that died just 4 miles north of here in a tragic accident off of Turkey Island on the Mississippi River.
It was Sunday, August the 22nd of 1852. My wife and I had recently become new grandparents, and so we decided that we were going to make the trip from St. Louis to Louisville to meet our new grandson, who had only been born a couple of months prior. So we decided to make the trip by steamboat. We purchased tickets aboard the Dr. Franklin II, which I thought to myself at the time was a rather odd name for a boat.
Well, we set out of St. Louis about 2 p.m. that day. It was a beautiful day to travel. Captain Harkins couldn't go that day because he was sick, which, well, worked out better for him in the end. But his clerk, Mr. Montgomery, he told us that the boat had only been built 4 years earlier in West Virginia in 1848.
The average speed of the Dr. Franklin II was only about 7 miles an hour. So while it wasn't a fast way to travel, it was definitely a lot smoother ride than going to Louisville on horseback. So needless to say, we had a lot of time to meet some of our fellow passengers.
One of those passengers was a man by the name of Ned Buntline. He was an author that wrote these dime store novels that, well, I'll have to be honest, I never read any of them. He told the most outlandish stories.
He told us a story that night about how he had once single-handedly captured 2 murderous villains and had received a $600 reward for it.
Well, we didn't know if we could believe him or not, or if that was just one of his stories.
So as we slowly made our way down the river, the sun began to set. It was late August, so it was a little muggy in our cabin. My wife and I decided that we would go above, out on the deck, and watch the sunset and watch the scenery pass by.
Little did we know that decision would cost us our lives. We never did make it to Kentucky to see our grandson. About 11 p.m. that night, like I said, we were about 4 miles out of St. Genevieve when the flue collapsed on the starboard side. And being a steamboat, it released a lot of steam, and it scalded us along with about 40 other passengers and crew that happened to be on deck at the time.
The boat was towed into St. Genevieve, where the local townspeople witnessed a gruesome scene of dead and dying passengers and crew. There were about 40 of us that perished, and they brought our bodies here to the cemetery and buried us in this area in a mass grave.
After the accident, they towed the Dr. Franklin to St. Louis and disposed of it by burning.
And just as our grave no longer has any type of stone to mark it, there are thousands of others in this cemetery who also have no stone to mark their graves. And we hope by sharing these words with you tonight and sharing our story that we will not be forgotten. So thank you for listening to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I am John Scott, and I was Missouri's first congressman. And I was born in 1782 in Virginia. When I was a teenager, my family moved to Vincennes, Indiana, and I went to school at Princeton, got my law degree from Princeton University, and moved to Missouri and settled in St. Genevieve. Opened my law practice here in St. Genevieve in the early 1800s. And I was known as a fairly rough around the edges guy, not afraid of a fight, and but generally somebody that could be trusted. And so I had a successful career as a lawyer here in St. Genevieve. In fact, I actually defended a gentleman at one point. Everybody knew he was guilty. The evidence pretty much pointed to the fact that he was guilty. But when the jury came back with the verdict, they said not guilty. And they asked him, they said, well, why would you come back with a verdict of not guilty? And they said, well, didn't John Scott ask us to come back with a verdict of not guilty? So, as I say, I was believable, and people trusted me, and I was not afraid of fight. In fact, I felt that a duel actually could be used in certain situations if you couldn't settle your differences in court. Now, in 1810, I married my first wife, Catherine. We had a daughter, Elizabeth, shortly after that. in 1815, 5 years later. Oops, sorry.
It's amazing the technology.
Yes, back there, yeah. It's for my wife's eye drops. She had eye surgery. So. But she's down the hill and she's got her eye drops. So let's see. Okay, so I married in 1810, and daughter Elizabeth was born shortly after that. In 1815, 5 years later, I lost both of them in 1 year. Early in the year, I lost my wife to in childbirth, and lost my daughter to cholera later on that same year. So I became a pretty lonely guy, still a fighter, still independent, and but I decided to enter the world of politics. So my first election was in 1816. Missouri was a territory at that time, and they were looking for a representative from the state. So I was in an election there, and I was losing by 7 votes on the night of on election night, but there was still one precinct in North St. Louis that was still coming in, and I had political friends there in St. Louis that were kind of pulling for me. So when that precinct did come in, I won by 15 votes. I was declared the winner. And so I hitched up my horse. I rode by horseback from St. Genevieve to Washington, D.C.
Oh, wow.
It took me 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the weather. But when I got to Washington, D.C., got to Congress, my opponent, Rufus Easton, was already there. And he declared that there was fraud in the election. So Congress debated about it, tried to decide whether there was or there wasn't, and they kind of got in a no-win situation, I guess. And so they declared the seat vacant for 1816, sent us both back to Missouri for another election in 1817, January of 1817. So we ran the election again. This time I won 400 votes, so it wasn't even close. I was a good kid. The story is told, and I know nothing about this, but the story is told that during that second election, there was a garrison from the local fort that came down and led people by fife and drum from their homes to the polling place. And somebody had set up a shed and with a table inside, and underneath the table was bread, meat, and whiskey for anybody that voted for the right candidate. So, but I know nothing about that. That's only a story that's told. So I like to say I did win that second election. I had a very successful career in Congress. I was reelected 4 different times. When I traveled from St. Genevieve to Washington, D.C., I was known as kind of a independent, I guess you might say. I wasn't afraid to travel, and was respected for my honesty. In fact, people actually gave me money to put in my bag and take to somebody in Washington, D.C. and deliver the money to, and never took any of their money, always delivered it. So I was considered a very honest man. But as I say, a little rough around the edges and wasn't afraid of a fight. I actually had a ornately carved dagger that I had on a rope around my neck. So when I traveled, I had that with me, and I also carried a Derringer pistol in my legal case. So anyway, like I say, I was reelected 4 different times. I was actually a part of the Appropriations Committee for public lands. So I was very instrumental in getting public lands for education. I was on the Board of Regents at the old academy up here. It's 2 blocks up the street here, which was Missouri's first Institute of Higher Learning at that time. But I was also one that arranged for lands to be purchased for Missouri's first state university. So I pretty much voted the constituency of my people back in Missouri, so I was very popular until the election of 1826. In that particular election, I decided that I didn't think that a military man had any business residing in the White House, so I did not back Andrew Jackson. Instead, I backed John Quincy Adams. Most of Missouri wanted me to go with Andrew Jackson, so I lost my popularity. I lost the election. John Quincy Adams lost his election, so it pretty much ended my congressional career. I came back home to Missouri in St. Genevieve and reestablished my law practice again. I mentioned that I wasn't afraid of a fight. There was a newspaper article written about me that wasn't very flattering, so I once challenged 5 different guys to a duel before breakfast. That duel never happened because all 5 of them backed down. They were afraid of me. However, I was a second in a duel that actually took place here in St. Genevieve. And a second is basically if the first guy doesn't show up, I'm the one pulling the trigger. But I didn't have to do that. The first guy did show up is Thomas Crittenden, and he had a beef with the brother of Dr. Walter Fenwick. Dr. Walter Fenwick lived in the house right down here on the corner, the greenhouse, catty corner to the cemetery. And Dr. Fenwick, the argument was with Dr. Fenwick's brother, who was kind of a seedy character. But for some reason, Dr. Fenwick felt that he should stand up for his brother, I guess. Well, Dr. Fenwick was a better physician than he was a marksman, and he ended up being shot and died in that duel. So I didn't have to participate in that other than I was there when they stepped it off. And so then, as I say, I married my second wife in 1850, and then in 1855, for those of you that are not from St. Genevieve, we have a French custom here called La Guillonne, and La Guillonne, and it's a custom where it's a kind of a parade led by fiddlers and singers and people in costume and just generally make merry and wander about the town and have a good time. And for some reason in 1855, the city fathers drafted an ordinance against that, practice of that. Well, there was still a bunch of stalwart Frenchmen that decided they were going to go ahead and do it anyway. And so the city attorney brought suit against them, and I was brought in to plead their case for the La Guillonne group. And evidently I was pretty successful in that, and actually quoted the fact that their right to perform the La Guillonne was guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. Now, nobody really questioned me on that, so I got away with that one, I guess. Anyway, they were acquitted. It was declared not guilty, and we all went to the tavern to celebrate after that. And so around 1860, my health started to decline. Dementia maybe sat in a little bit, but I was still a fighter. One night as I was laying in bed, I all of a sudden just bolted out of bed, grabbed my Derringer and pointed it up in the air. I said, "Show me the traitor that wants to take down this country." So I guess things were my fight was still in me, but I was getting close to the end. And then as things were kind of closing down on me, people said, "You know, you ought to get religion." And I said, "Well, I've served the devil all my life, and I don't see any reason to desert him now." So I died on October 1st, 1861. I'm John Scott. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Brokefus, and I represent the Germans who are buried in this cemetery. There's a reason why there are so many Germans in Missouri. A man named Godfrey Duden from Germany lived west of St. Louis for a couple of years. He went back to Germany and wrote a book. In his book, he said, "Go to Missouri. It is the place to be. The rolling hills and the rivers will remind you of home, but there's so much more economic opportunity in Missouri." some 30,000 Germans heeded his advice. He even said, don't go too far north, it's too cold in the winter. And south of Missouri, it's too hot in the summer. Well, what do we have here? He said that Missouri would be tolerable in the summer if you settled along a river or on top of a breezy hill. Well, if you think about it, they came up through New Orleans. Many settled in Perry County south of here, St. Genevieve, St. Louis, Herman, along the rivers following his advice. Well, my parents came here about 1840. I came with them when I was about 10 years old. My husband arrived to be a couple of years after that, Maximilian Okenfuss. He was sent here, his travel was paid for by his uncle, who was Lawrence Oken, and he wrote the last museum, encyclopedia of plants, animals, and minerals. And he corresponded with this other guy named Maximilian von Nudie. This guy, this prince, had been specifically in St. Genevieve and wrote about the flora, fauna, and the mineral assets in this area. So this could have influenced Lawrence Oken to send his nephew over here. Anyway, Maximilian and I had 11 children. 4 of our little girls are buried in this cemetery, but I don't know exactly where because their graves were marked with wooden crosses, and those have rotted away. I outlived 7 of my 11 children. Some of my adult sons were successful businessmen in town. One was a tinsmith. He put the tin roofs on many of these roofs in town. Another was a carpenter. He built the coffins that are buried underground here. But I myself am not buried in this cemetery. I lived to be 90 years old. So by 1920, when I died, this cemetery was already closed for 40 years. So I'm buried across town in the new cemetery. I'm telling you this story because you're hearing a lot of French stories in this cemetery tonight, and I'm letting you know about the Germans who settled here. The French founded St. Genevieve, but 100 years later the Germans came in and kind of outnumbered the French by then.
Come on in close enough if you can't hear me. Let me introduce myself. My name is Prospect K. Robinson. Everybody calls me PK. I was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1782. Growing up, I was considered to be somewhat educated. I enjoyed math. I really enjoyed being in the outdoors and looking at the stars. I'd heard of this westward expansion the United States was involved in. So in 1810, I moved to St. Charles, just west of St. Louis. I worked as a school teacher. I worked as a surveyor. I even taught surveying. And in 1813, I enlisted, served as first lieutenant of Callaway's company of Rangers. In 1815, May, I was discharged. A few weeks after that, I received a letter from a gentleman by the name of William Rector. He was the Surveyor General of the United States. His office was in St. Louis. And his job was to survey the upper Louisiana Territory, which was part of the Louisiana Purchase. The United States had purchased 828,000 square miles for $15 million from France. At that meeting, I met a gentleman by the name of Joseph C. Brown. Mr. Brown and Mr. Rector had done survey work together over in Illinois, so they knew each other. Mr. Rector explained the survey work he needed done. Mr. Brown was going to survey an east-west line. I was going to survey a north-south line. My line was described as the 5th principal meridian. The 4th and the 3rd principal meridians are over in Illinois. It's a major survey line where everything is based off of. We were to gather a crew. The crew consisted of 2 chainmen. This is a chain. These are chaining pins. This is what we use to measure with. We were to acquire a compass. The compass was to be made of Rittenhauser construction. David Rittenhauser was a maker of very fine scientific instruments. We were to get our crew, 2 chainmen, 2 axemen, a cook, an instrument man, and myself making the notes. We were to meet in front of St. Louis on the Mississippi River with our equipment, supplies. We loaded onto a flat-bottom boat, floated down the Mississippi River. I don't know if you're familiar with St. Genevieve, but there's Saline Creek a couple miles south of town here. There was a village and a lot of salt springs. We stopped off there to pick up our salt for the expedition, continued on south. We stopped off at the St. Francis River, and Mr. Brown got out and made camp. We floated on down to the Arkansas River, made camp. A couple days later, Mr. Brown headed west. His compass was to keep him heading west. We headed north. The compass was to keep us running north. After 57 miles, we intersected Mr. Brown's west line. That was on November 6, 1815. That point is called the initial point of the 5th principal meridian. All the deeds in Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, and half of South Dakota is based off of that point. November 6th is when we intersected. We continued on north. After 317 miles, we intersected the south bank of the Missouri River. Our job was complete. Gathered up our notes, our plats, headed back to St. Charles. I organized everything, headed on back into Mr. Richter's office, turned everything over to him. Our job was complete. Fall of 1816, I married my wife, Elizabeth Evans, 2 children, Jesse and Joseph. Jesse ended up moving down here to St. Genevieve. Joseph followed him. Joseph was county coroner for quite a few years. He eventually moved back up to St. Charles. Jesse stuck around here. We eventually moved down here. Jesse was an attorney. He was circuit clerk and recorder, state rep. He also was a surveyor. And if you're familiar with St. Gen, just west of the post office is Jesse B. Robbins' house. It's an historic site. And my wife always wanted me to be baptized. In May of 1847, I was baptized. June 3rd, 1847, I died. I'm buried somewhere here in the cemetery. There's a bench over there that with a box on it. In real life, I'm a surveyor. I'm also a county surveyor. And they were restoring the cemetery here, so they put this walkway in. And the county surveyors decided we donated a bench in PK's name, and there's a plaque on the other side of the bench with the dedication. And it also has an outline of Missouri and Arkansas, and it shows where the 5th principal meridian is.
So, bonjour and bienvenue. Hello and welcome. Do you know who I am? Well, then I must say then that Dr. Carl Eckberg, in his book, Colonial St. Genevieve, was correct when he described me as a virtual unknown. And my name is Francois Leclerc. I came to St. Genevieve for a reason. I came here in 1770. I came from a place called New France. Do you know where New France, when I say New France, where I'm talking about? Canada, Quebec. More specifically, Cap-Santé, Deschambault, east of Quebec City along the St. Lawrence River. But I came here for a reason. I came here to be the secretary and the scribe for the most powerful, the wealthiest man in Upper Louisiana, a man by the name of Francois Valley. I came here to be his secretary scribe. I'm the person responsible for thousands of pages of documents, civil documents, that you're going to find here in the courthouse of St. Genevieve, all in my handwriting, written in French. And you're going to find them here, and you're also going to find them buried in the vaults of Seville, Spain, because we were Spanish territory at the time. I came here from I came here in 1770. I was the secretary of the scribe. I ended up marrying the niece of Francois Valley. You see, Francois Valley was illiterate. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, and any time that he wrote his name, he would write Valley, V-A-L-L-E. I would come and write Francois in front of it. So anytime you see a Francois Valley signature, it's in two different persons' handwriting, mine and his. As things would have it, I married the niece, Marie-Louise Valley, and we had 1776 we got married. We had a son in 1778. We named him Francois. He died a month before his third birthday. 1780 we had a second son. We named him Louis, after the King of France at the time. And then in 1782 we had a third son, and we named him Francois. So we lived in the old town of St. Genevieve in the 1780s, and there was a series of floods. And these floods dispersed the town in three different directions. There was a group that went south down by the Saline Creek, where they got their salt, about 5 miles south of St. Genevieve. There was another group that went to the bluffs overlooking the old town of St. Genevieve, which is now the Valley Spring Estates. And then there was a third group that settled between the Gabourey Creeks, current location of St. Genevieve. The Leclercs settled on the bluffs overlooking the old town. 1789, I passed away at the age of 39. I left behind a 9-year-old son named Louis, and then my 7-year-old son named Francois, in addition to my wife, who was 13 years older than me. But my wife had, I was buried in the old town of St. Genevieve. But then with the series of floods in 1789, when I was buried in 1793, my wife, Marie-Louise Valley, had me exhumed. Church records indicate that I was exhumed from the old town and buried in the new cemetery, which is here. They don't know exactly where I'm buried, but I'm telling you I'm buried here because family is buried. There's 4 generations besides me. There's 3 generations of the Leclercs buried here. Family buried with family. So, no doubt I was buried here. My son, Francois, was buried right here. And then his daughters are buried here, and their grandchildren. So, I'm buried here. So, per French custom, they would always come into the home the day after a death and do a respectable estate inventory of all your possessions. Now, I died in 1789. They did not do the estate inventory until 1793. Why? Why did they wait so long to do the estate inventory for me? You have to remember, I was the scribe. I was the secretary. I'm the one that did all the civil documents. There was nobody. There was a lot of illiterates in St. Genevieve colonial times. Most people would sign their name with the next. So the reason why there was no estate inventory done was because there was nobody to do it for a few years. So they finally found somebody to do it. They did the respectable estate inventory of our possessions, and the estate was valued at 53,000 livres, which translate into American dollars of $530,000. So 1793, $530,000 is a lot of money. We were very wealthy. $530,000 is a lot of money in 2022. But it was a lot of money in 1793. But let me ask you this. What was our most valuable asset? Slaves. It was the slaves. We had 9 slaves valued at over 40% of our estate. What was our second most valuable asset? Somebody said land. No, it's not land, because third generation, Louis and Francois had a lawsuit, children had a lawsuit, 450 acres down in the Le Grand Champ, the big field, 450 acres, they sold to settle this lawsuit between the two families. They sold that 450 acres of pristine prime farmland for $150. Louis had 6 children. Francois had 6 children. So they took $150 divided by 12. They got about $11 a piece. So the land was not valuable. The second most valuable asset on the estate was something ratafia. Ratafia. What is ratafia? It's a sweet rum. It's a liquor, booze. 1,200 lavors of this ratafia translated $12,000 worth of ratafia. We had wine too, but that was the second most valuable asset, was the ratafia. The French they really enjoyed themselves, and that was common, and they still enjoy themselves. So, but anyway, there are 4 generations, as I said, of Leclerc's buried here. Francois, his daughter Diana Marie. Diana Marie married Michael Brendamore Menard. Michael Brendamore Menard is the founder of Galveston, Texas. And again, some of you had already heard that, and you won't hurt my feelings if you walk away. But Michael Brendamore Menard married Diane Marie Leclerc in 1833, and they had a daughter named Emily. And in 1834, Diane and Emily were on their way to Galveston, and they both died of Gulf fever on the way. So she's not buried here. This is in memory of. And then there's Cecily Leclerc, who was the daughter of Francois Leclerc and Felicity Beauvais, Cecily. And then there's Lieutenant Colonel, who would be my great-grandson. So this is the part where I said you can go visit my great-grandson, or you can go visit my in-laws. Or if you did not come for the beginning, I'm going to start over and give you the beginning of the story. And then when I get to the part that you've already heard, you won't hurt my feelings when you walk away.
J'ai passé devant ta porte. I cry every time I pass your door.
Well, I am Louis Balduc, and this is my 2 wives, my first and my second
Split personality.
wife. Yeah. I was actually born in Canada, St. Joachim, Canada, which is about 25 miles from Quebec. And I was that area was sometimes known as New France because a lot of the French immigrants were there. During the French and Indian War, the Brits, when they were heading to Quebec, burnt a lot of the cities along the way, and my city got burnt down to the ground. So I left and came down to St. Genevieve, to Old Town St. Genevieve. I came for probably a number of reasons. It was kind of a French enclave, so people spoke French, and I was comfortable with that. And I also saw a lot of opportunities here. And finally, I found a person that I really was in love with and decided to marry. And also I decided to marry up because I was, even though I was illiterate, I had a good sense of business. And I also had good taste in my wife.
His first wife, Agatha, was from Kaskaskia.
to Old Town. Had 4 children within a small span of time. The oldest daughter, Elizabeth, and Elizabeth did live into the only one of his children that lived into an older age. Then their 2 sons, and they married also and had children, but they died. They were in their mid to late 30s. Between the daughter and the 2 sons, they had a total of 6 grandchildren. Then there was a 4th child born that, died at birth, and Agatha died shortly afterwards. Agatha was gone for 3 months. Louis was out of town when she died, and it was 3 months later that by the time Louis got word that his wife had died and was able to get back home, 3 months had passed.
And she was in the grave. And I was actually in New Orleans at the time. I had really become a pretty good business person at that point. I owned some lead mines, and lead was a very big commodity back then. I also did a lot of trading, buying and selling it. So I'd go to New Orleans on a pretty regular basis and buy goods, bring it back upriver, and sell it. And that's where I was when she passed away. French law is really interesting in that one of the things they do is they will do an appraisal as soon as one of the spouses die. So that appraisal, because it took me quite a while to get back, was already done. And what that does is that it appraises every piece of goods that I owned. So it was spoons, it was tables, it was, furniture, it was pretty much farm implements, pretty much everything. The reason I do that is then that's divided between the surviving spouse, which would have been me, and my children. The second thing, based on French law, was that they make a decision on whether or not I keep the children or not. And these are 3 children. And it was decided that I would get to keep my children. Otherwise, they'd give them to godparents or whomever. So with a grandchild, with the oldest grandchild being 7 years old, I had 3 children. I had to find a wife. I had to get remarried to have someone help me so I could continue to do the work that I wanted to do. And that's when I met Marie.
Marie being his second wife. But real quick, I want to tell you that Agatha, when she died, the cemetery she was buried in, it flooded. They were real close to the river in Old Town, and her body, she's not buried here, her body washed down the river. He likes to say that
she's somewhere in the Mississippi or Gulf of Mexico.
Oh, yeah. So they're not real sure where she is. She's definitely not in this cemetery. The second wife, Marie, was 17 years his junior. She did very quickly have 2 pregnancies, and both of those babies died at birth. But she did help Louis raise the 3 surviving children of Agatha. At some point, they know that we have documentation that Elizabeth, the oldest daughter, was sent to live with her godfather. And we're not real sure sometimes if there was a static between one of the parents and the child, they would send the child off to the godparent, or if the godparent had a particular skill or a trade that they could teach that child, they would send the children to the godparent, and that godparent would raise the child until it married.
When we've talked about this, we've seen a lot of moms kind of shake their heads. Yeah, 13, yeah, I could send them off too.
So we're not sure, but we do know if it was static in the relationship, they do know because we have documents showing that when Marie had the second baby that lived for a couple of weeks, she had asked Elizabeth to be the godmother. And she wouldn't have done that if she didn't have a good relationship with her. Also, Marie stood up for Elizabeth when she married. So they're pretty sure that it did mend if it was a problem. Marie was married to Louis when they moved from Old Town to here, and the house on Main Street, the Balduc home here on Main Street, was built. The house was 1,200 square feet. They were wealthy, prominent people. 1,200 feet back then was considered a large home. It's the best example we have of French Creole architecture. It has the hip roofs. They had galley porches where in the summertime, it being so hot, they would live out there. They would sleep out there. It was a comfortable place to be, so they did most everything out there on those porches. They had the big stockade fence around. They had pigs, wild pigs here in St. Genevieve. The Baldukes had plots of land around that home, and they grew crops. And so they built that great big stockade fence to keep the animals out of their crops. There are two pieces if you visit. Has anybody visited the house? There's the flood that in 1785 that convinced them they needed to move to higher ground. That's where Louis and Agatha's home was. There's a piece of furniture in this house, if you visited, that is still stained to this day of the high water mark where the flood waters were when that house was built. So it's pretty interesting to see that it's still there. It's, it shows how high the water was.
And they salvaged, as most of the inhabitants here, they salvaged what they could from Old Town. So they even think some of the timbers from the original house are in this house here. So the Baldukes were really known mainly for this house. I mean, this was one of the oldest French Creole homes. It's intact, and it's something to be very proud of. But I also think that there's something to be said for Louis Balduc. He never learned to read and write. He only learned French, and that was it. Even after we became a colony, before the United States became part of the United States, he spoke French, and even with that, he was able to amass a good amount of money. He had at the top of his career, he had over 25 slaves. They had a lot of buildings all over, farms, etc. And even at the time of his death in 1815, he had over 10,000 in American dollars. He had all these properties, so he still had 10 slaves at the time of his death.
He was buried here in this cemetery. They closed the cemetery, and in the new old cemetery, the rest of the descendants to the Balduc family are buried over there, and they wanted Grandpa over there. So there is a document showing that the body was moved. We don't know where over there, but we know he has been moved. The family owned this house until 1949. So there were descendants in this house that was built in the late 1700s. There were descendants in the house.
The last descendant was Zoe Balduc. And she sold it, and then it was given to the Dames, and then ultimately it became part of the National Park System. Any questions?